Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. My name is Sam Johnson. Before we kick off, I want to take a moment to acknowledge country. We're here recording on Bidjigal, Gadigal country here today. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and pay our deepest respect to elders both past and present. Wherever you're watching this around the country, this is always was and always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded by treaty. And today we're sitting down for a pretty heavy but pretty relevant and special episode today as we reflect on the current climate in this country around domestic and family violence. And it's really critical that we hold space for these conversations to try and unpack and understand and really try and work out where we go to from here in terms of addressing both what we need on the ground, what we need from a systems and policy level, and everything else in between. So if you're following along and you're watching this online and you follow the Impact Policy Podcast, can you please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, follow along so you can stay up to date with the most recent episodes as they go live. And for anything else as well, please engage in the comments. Please let us know what you think. If you have any questions around anything that's come up in this episode for yourself personally, professionally, and anything like that, please reach out to us directly, and we'll do our best to connect you with the relevant people and organisations to try and connect those dots as well. So, joined here by an old friend. So whilst we're here to talk about pretty heavy and pretty significant stuff, I feel comfortable that I can hold space with someone who I've known for a long time and who I have a lot of respect for personally and professionally. So Regan, I might give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from and what we're here to yarn about.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Thanks so much for the invite, and thank you for all the work that you're doing and bringing attention to really important subjects that we should be talking about, like this one, men's violence against women. As you said, my name is Regan Mitchell. I'm a proud Wiradjuri Ngunnawal woman, born and raised in Cowra, New South Wales in the Central West.
God's country.
Yeah. I've been living in Sydney for about 15 years now on Bidjigal land, and I want to pay my respects to the land we're on today as well. And it's just important when we're talking about this subject to always remember that men's violence against women has never been part of our culture and our tradition, and it's only been brought into us in some colonisation.
Yeah,
as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're at today in terms of, I guess, your background to this sort of space and your expertise in this sort of area and what's got you to where you are today?
Yeah. First and foremost, what informs kind of my work is the fact that I am an Aboriginal woman who, sadly, for most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, we have a lifetime of experience and exposure in some way of men's violence against women. So that always informs kind of how I approach the work. Secondly, my past role, where we met in Waterloo at WEAVE. I did work nearly 10 years on a frontline service in a domestic violence service that we worked intensively with women and children who were in the thick of violence. It was a great program to work in because I had the privilege of meeting a woman and their family at the beginning of their journey when they put their hand up and said, look, I want to leave, or they've just left. And we know that when a woman's first leaving or they've left, that's the most dangerous time for them in those first days, weeks and months, because that's when their ex-partner or partner is losing that control. So I was able to, our old program didn't have a cut-off time for when we had to not work with that person, which is how it should be.
Totally.
And some of my clients stayed with me for 2 years, some 6 years, and even longer. Different levels of support, and that looked like every day. Where you're going to live, if you are able to stay at home, which often you're not, providing safety upgrades to the house like cameras, literally everything that impacts your life and your kid's life has to be work has to, go into play to to try and set yourself up, but mostly stay safe when you're first leaving. So that could be going to the police station, making a report, going through that court process, which is very hard and traumatic. Instantly when you do that, if you've got kids, there's a mandatory report made. So navigating the child protection system, which is extremely problematic, especially for First Nations women, as you know.
Totally.
Anything, family law, divorces, breaking a tenancy lease because you've had to move out without penalties, immigration, changing schools, emotional support, counselling, literally everything you can think of. When you're in a violent relationship, it impacts every aspect of your life, and the aftermath is huge.
Absolutely. I think, personally, I had no concept in terms of the actual breadth of work that goes into providing support for women and families that are escaping violence. To hear some of that sort of stuff. You touched on a couple of really important things there around, I guess, one, like the time and how long you work with families and how critical it is to not have, really short exit processes where you just work with a family in an immediate crisis or something like that. And then you talked about something else around mandatory reporting. And, that women with children, that reports are made. And I know where you had a bit of a yarn about some of the barriers to leaving violence and leaving relationships, particularly for our people, and particularly for women. And can you talk about some of that, like some of the challenges around why it's so hard for our women, in that sort of space?
Yeah, so it's hard for any woman to be leaving a violent relationship, and that's a fact. But for our women, it's the additional barriers. What we know is that, and all women have told me this, so it's really important for me to honour the voices of what I've been told, because I worked with women from all backgrounds. And what I know from all women, black, white, rich, poor, is that there's this universal feeling of shame, like a really intense feeling of shame when they're in a relationship or that's experiencing violence from a partner, which as a society, that's on us.
Yeah.
We are shaming women.
Totally.
And to me, that's one of the most devastating parts of this whole thing, that women who would see the signs, and we know stuff that's coming up before it got to the other end of the scale where it's so severe, but we're not telling people because we're getting judged.
Yeah.
So for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, it's so much harder around that shame. And also around, we talk about the fear of going to police, but it's not just a fear, it's justifiable fear.
Absolutely.
Because we know that, and I saw it firsthand, and people that haven't seen it firsthand, so mainstream society, they actually wouldn't believe the things that I've seen. They would think that I'm missing out parts of the story. They think I've exaggerated or lied. The level of different treatment and the racism and discrimination that is still in play right now with women experiencing violence coming forward. So number one, if you're going to get believed or not.
Absolutely.
And that first time, if you feel that if you don't get believed the first time, you're not coming back.
Absolutely.
You're not coming back to a service, you're not going back to the hospital, you're not going back to the police.
Totally.
And then as police are mandatory reporters for all women, if with children, we know then the child protection system responds differently for our women, where you are at, have real risk of losing your children. And for me, I just, it's mind-blowing to me, because for any woman to put their hand up and identify that they're in a violent relationship, that to me demonstrates the most responsible parenting that you can have.
Absolutely.
Going through that shame, knowing that, there's going to be backlash, knowing that if you've come forward that you become more unsafe, not just from the perpetrator, from your partner, but from then the systems.
Totally.
So that's what we do to women. We shame women into silence, and all women. But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, it's just so much more. The stakes are just so much higher.
Yeah.
And it's not every time there are good police and there are good child protection workers, but one time's too many.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about that shame, and as opposed to, there's so much strength in that vulnerability to seek help and as opposed to celebrating that strength and that vulnerability to try and escape and try to seek help, we shame it.
And we further penalise them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You reflected on some of the stuff that you opened with around what you were doing in community when you were working with that service. You talked about so much stuff. And I know that you're in a different role now where you're not doing frontline casework anymore, and you're working at a strategy and a policy level. And, you know, as someone who's in that world as well, who worked on the front line and now works in a strategy and policy level, I think sometimes there's a disconnect between that work and what the reality is on the ground. So I think I'd really love to have a yarn about, I guess, your insight from that professional experience in terms of what's really critical that we've got to understand, and anything else as well that would be valuable.
Yeah, I think specifically domestic violence, it takes a very specific set of a skill set to work with women experiencing violence, and a specific personality and characteristics as well that you can't learn. You can't learn this at a social work with a social work degree. You can't learn this out of a textbook, because the most important thing, if you want to be able to support someone to go on, not just to escape violence and abuse, but to go on and live a sustainable life that's permanently free from violence and abuse, and also go on and be successful and break the cycle. So I think that people as I said, I loved my role on the front line, and it was a privilege, and I wouldn't change a day of it. But what happened, Sam, at the end was increasingly I was sick of nothing ever changing. I was sick of the same thing happening again and again. And it was interesting, in the last kind of client work that I was involved a newborn baby who was in a coma, hospitalised from domestic violence from the perpetrator.
Yeah, wow.
And despite lots of good work that I was able to contribute to that horrific situation, it just cemented to me that I'm sick of no change. So for me, it was really important, and that now in my new role at Our Watch, which is a national organisation dedicated to preventing violence against women. So we work in stopping violence before it starts, which is the other end of the scale. And I think it's really important that the work that I've done over meeting hundreds of women a year and kids a year, and speaking to and hearing from them, it's really good to inform this role that I'm in as a strategy role, and how we can prioritise the work in a national organisation which works on the other end of the scale, which addressing attitudes and the drivers of violence, which I can talk to you about as well. So I think it's really important to humanise what I know happened, and like I said, things that I've seen that are happening today, not 100 years ago.
Absolutely.
That need to inform how we work in the preventative space, knowing that crime prevention work is a critical component, but it's all of those parts, and a holistic approach needs to be applied to stop violence against women.
You said a bit earlier, you're working on the front line and you just got so frustrated that nothing's changing. So if you could talk to what are some of the critical movers that need to change at a systems level or policy level that you sort of felt on the ground doing that daily sort of grind on the front line, what are some of the biggest things that need to sort of shift?
So working with actual women was just incredible. I always say this, and it's honestly true, that the women that I got to spend my time with at work are the most incredible, creative, impressive women and mothers I've ever met in my life. So it wasn't that, it was the other stuff. So lack of resources, so frontline services being resourced properly to not be having waiting lists and turning women away. We cannot afford to turn a woman away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it might be the last time they come back, especially for black fellas.
Absolutely.
They're not going to come back. So having that properly resourced frontline service, having there's all these parts. So working with victim survivors to allow proper healing, working that early intervention space, working with men, doing men's work, There's perpetrator accountability with the police and the systems like child protection. Being able to have, like, knowing that the policies are safe for our women, and there's accountability attached to that. So external accountability. We all need accountability. It's not a criticism. It should be something that we all invite, because we all need that in our workplaces. And it's just the whole big picture. What I'm doing now with our Watchers organisation is addressing the key driver of violence, which I'm not sure if many people actually understand this out of this space, that the key driver of violence for all women is gender inequality.
Yeah, true.
That's what the evidence tells us, that's linked.
Okay.
But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, the evidence tells us that it's gender inequality, but with the additional factors of impacts of colonisation for us as blackfellas, which we know what that means, racism, trauma, disconnection of culture, discrimination, not being equal.
Absolutely.
And then the other one is, which is interesting, impacts of colonisation on non-Indigenous people. So the impacts of colonisation on the rest of Australia, and we don't often hear it framed like that.
Yeah.
But what that looks like is, a good example is the belief system and the stereotyping that mainstream Australia, a lot of white people are, not all, born into, which is that blackfellas are lazy. We don't know how to look after our kids.
Yep.
We need saving. We're criminals, we're violent, we're dumb, all those kinds of things. But in what we're talking about now, a really good example is the country's having this national conversation and calling it a crisis. Why is that happening now? It's happening now because we've got this spike in murders, but there are a spike in murders of non-Indigenous women.
Absolutely.
Which it's really important that we say, I've never heard of, and I never will hear of, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander woman who doesn't care about another woman being harmed, unsafe, assaulted, murdered, or a white woman or any other background. It's just not who we are. We care about all women. But for us, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, this is so personal. This has been happening for so long, since colonisation, when the fact is that, white men have been raping and bashing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women from colonisation with little or no accountability. So that still to this day, the tolerance and the acceptance of violence against our women doesn't even resemble the outrage and the response that other women get, which of course they should get that. Of course we want that attention on all women, and as it should be, more attention. But the fact is, that's an impact of colonisation on non-Indigenous people to me, a really good example of the level of care, the level of what matters compared to a white woman, a middle-class woman, compared to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman. And I think about then that next step is, depending on who the white woman is, how white, middle-class, how blonde, how pretty,
the ideal victim
in westernized standards of beauty, which is a really ugly thing to say, but it's true.
Absolutely.
The media will dictate, and the leaders of this country dictate how we respond, how angry we get, and even how hard we're supposed to grieve, depending on who you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's, to me, is a good example of what we're talking about, of impacts of colonisation on non-Indigenous people. And it's current now. It's not from when, 200 years ago. This is what's happening now, and we're seeing it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a parliamentary inquiry at the moment into missing and murdered Aboriginal people, and I think Amy McQuire and Chelsea Wattergo on that talk very staunchly about the failed representation of blackfellas that are experiencing violence, particularly women. And it comes back to that notion of exactly what you're saying, the ideal victim. If you're not white, middle class, and fit these certain characteristics, then your profile as worthy of victimhood is less, perceived. And there's evidence and research that reinforces all of that, and I think you're right. Like, I think it's tragic that, it's great we're having these conversations, we're sitting there, there's this platform to talk about this national issue, but it's, we know that our women and our families have been navigating this at an overrepresented rate for a very, very long time with little to no, same level of attention.
Exactly, and the whole country doesn't even know about that because those women haven't been worthy to make mainstream media.
Totally. When I was teaching years ago, and I did a class on deaths in custody, and one of the case studies I used was Miss Dew in WA, and we were debating about whether, because she, when police arrested her, it was for unpaid fines. She had a warrant out for unpaid fines. She died in custody. We had this debate about whether, what about that issue. And anyway, I had this challenging sort of student, and I walked away from that class, and I went and I sat down. I read the coroner's report because I just felt like I didn't know enough about the case apart from what I'd seen on media. And when I read the coroner's report, like, she was in a domestic violence situation and she called the police for help, and the police came, and instead of helping her, they arrested her. And then she passed away as a result of, subsequent instances that happened after that event. And that's just, it just reinforces everything that we're talking about in terms of the lived reality for what it is for our people trying to seek, seek support.
Yeah. And the fact that most Australians are never going to even hear about that.
Yeah.
To be able to even have an opportunity to be empathetic and be part of the solution and to stop the racism. They're never going to hear about that.
Definitely. You talked about something the other day when we had a yarn about some of the biggest sort of, I guess, things you're seeing right now in this sort of space. And I can't remember the language and term you used for it, but I'd love if we could have a bit of a yarn, if you could talk us through some of that stuff for people listening.
I think you're referring to perpetrator misidentification.
Yeah, that's it.
Which kind of goes together with coercive control, which is something else you mentioned. I think about perpetrator misidentification when I think about coercive control, a good example of that. But it's an increasingly very popular tactic that violent and abusive men use on their partners or ex-partners. So what that means is, I want to give you an example of a client that I've got permission to speak about.
Yep.
It was a First Nations woman, and I guess the biggest examples I have of this are with black women with non-Indigenous men that I've seen the most severe cases of, where the victim is misidentified as the perpetrator. So how that comes about is, in this case, is there'd been violence on and off for years, and as unfortunately for Aboriginal women, they mostly don't come forward, and this woman had never gone to the police. This couple had broken up. She was going to pick up her son from him, and he ended up being angry and grabbed her around the throat and pinned her up against the wall. So with her spare hand, she's swiped as you would, trying to break free. She's gone home after that, gone to bed, had 2 small children, gone to bed. At 3 o'clock in the morning, her doorbell rings and the police are there to arrest her. So her ex-partner has gone and rang the police and charged her with assault.
Yeah, wow.
Told the police, obviously, his story of events. They've arrested her at 3 a.m. and it's important to know this woman had no criminal history. So can you imagine getting arrested at 3 a.m. After you've just been strangled?
Yeah.
And she actually had to wake her neighbours up to look after her small children, to go off with the police. She had bruising around her neck from being choked. She then gave her statement, but she sat in a cell for 10 hours because the arresting police station had to get there and they were busy. So they've come there. She's then told them what happened. They've took photos of her bruises, but they've charged her with assault occasioning actual bodily harm. So she's then come to us and told us. So obviously, of course, we've gone back to the police station, explained the story and the situation. But what happens is a lot is our women don't get believed the same.
Absolutely.
And I've found in some cases, it's a first in, best dressed policing style. Whoever goes first, that's what sticks. Despite my former workplace CEO and myself working so hard, meetings, complaints process that went on for over 9 months to try and overturn that with, us being experts in this space.
Yeah, absolutely.
She had to go off to family law court then as a convicted violent perpetrator.
Fucking hell.
Like, it's just unbelievable. If you knew this family and this woman, and that will stick with her forever. She could have lost her child. Obviously, child protection gets involved. Through a lot of work, she's okay and gone off to have, a good life, but she still has that conviction.
Yeah.
So why would any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander woman be expected, look, call the police, just leave?
Totally.
She became more unsafe. Because now she's labelled, and the narrative is that she's a violent perpetrator.
Yeah, totally.
And the trauma that comes with that is, some of that's irreversible.
And they're the stories that we hear and we grow up hearing, or we hear them around our community perpetuated, that reinforce why we won't seek help, why we won't reach out.
So you asked me before the other day around coercive control, so that's an example of where you're controlling and perpetrating abuse that's not physical because any woman, well, most women will tell you, especially black women will tell you, they'd rather get bashed than have child protection on your doorstep.
Yeah, 100%.
It's safer. So there's an example where coercive control may exist with physical violence, but it may not. And a lot of women will tell you, the other type of abuse is often worse. I had another client who had been bashed like countless times from her ex-partner, but he controlled her after they broke up by accessing her social media. And it's very easy to do, apparently, like the little spyware you can buy, and her emails. And he actually, via her email posing to be her, he sent her father a nude picture of her.
Wow,
and
that's fucking sick.
Isn't it? And when she came to me, her hair had started to fall out from the stress. She said, I'd rather get bashed any day over this. Yeah. So there's like an example of another form of controlling someone and perpetrating abuse through systems. Yeah.
Yeah, I know this one young person who had a toxic relationship and split up with the person, blocked them on all accounts, and then what they would do is they would pay ID and then message them in the subject line in pay ID, so they still had that communication. And I was just like, fucking hell, like,
very clever ways. And the perpetrator misidentification is so easy. You only have to rock up to the police station and make a report. And it's so easy to do. And if you're not willing to look at the other side and investigate that properly before you lay that charge, knowing that this is what perpetrators do, it's becoming more and more popular, then women are going to be even, in such dangerous positions.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about, I was sitting in the cafe having a coffee with a lad the other day, and we were talking about DV. And funnily enough, like that day, a block away, a woman was stabbed at the gym in Alexandria by intimate partner. It was that morning. That's why I remember it clear as day. And we were having a yarn about this sort of stuff. And he was like, man, like besides raising a son that's a good person, he's like, what is my role? Like, what can I do? So like, I'm imagining that there's a lot of people listening to this that are, that are strong fellas out there. They are working in spaces where they might have some influence or something. Like, where do we even start? You talked about like the range of factors that are impacting men's violence, but like if we can start somewhere, if you have advice for people listening, like what can we do?
Yeah, there's so much men can do, and there's a real place where we actually need men to get involved. We all know lots of really good men, so I just want to say that we all know lots of good men, but just being a good man, like what your mate said, is not enough. There's so many opportunities on a really small scale that mightn't seem are going to make an impact, but it really does. So I'm just going to give you an example. Let's just say you went up the road after this and you went for a run with a mate, and a woman is running past you, and your mate makes a comment about that woman, a sexualised comment, a disrespectful comment, something about her appearance. You have an opportunity to, even though that's subtle and he didn't go up and punch her in the face, you have an opportunity to say nothing, laugh and join in, or to pull it up. because the work that I do now with Our Watch, the evidence tells us that, as I said before, the general driver for violence against women is gender inequality. But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, it's those other things as well. But it's the disrespect, it's the misogyny, that entitlement that some and a lot of men have over women to be able to say and do things and treat women how they, whatever they feel like, and say things that they would never say to their sister or their mother. But, you know, you have an opportunity where you can say something like, brother, like, I don't want to hear that. Like, don't talk about women like that.
You make yourself look silly.
We're sitting here saying this now, and it's like, yeah, of course I'd say that. But it's actually hard in those moments to say that. Because, you know, you might get someone say back to you, oh, settle down, I'm just joking. But that's when we need to arm ourselves to say, well, no, we can't be joking about things like that, because that is linked to violence against women. The evidence tells us that. That disrespect, there's no place for that anymore. And surely, like, you know, we have, I believe there's really good men around and society around that do not think that it's okay for women. And we can't just talk about women being murdered, because that's what's happening now. Women are nearly being murdered every day, and so suffering every day. So if we know that that's linked, because the evidence base tells us that, we can't be engaging or tolerating that kind of talk. And it's really tricky. It could be in a public setting, but there's opportunities every day to speak to it and pull it up. And they're really subtle, but they're impactful. And we actually need men to jump in when it's actually counts, not just when it's easy. We're talking about gender inequality a lot here. The truth is, men don't listen to women like men listen to men because of that exact reason. So men have a really powerful position here to kind of contribute to this work. And I think about even role modelling what masculinity looks like. So we were brought up, and women are responsible for this as well. We bring young men up from babies with this programming to think what masculinity is. And, you know, especially if you think of black fellas, tackle harder. Be tough. You know, if you're a deadly fighter or not.
Totally.
But, you know, now, and I was brought up like that too, but now knowing what I know, for me, if you ask me what healthy masculinity is, what real strength in a man is, I'm going to tell you things like someone who can make themselves vulnerable, someone who can share their emotions and say, I'm actually scared about this, or I'm upset about this, someone who can communicate well, someone who can admit when they're wrong, all those things. So men, just ordinary men on the street, and men like you can actually role model that by doing that themselves. And what that will actually do will open a space, a safe space for another man to think, oh, you know, I really respected that, and maybe I can do that. Because we actually put this huge pressure on men to be this certain way, to be a man. But we know, the evidence tells us that harmful masculinity is linked to violence against women. And it might think, how can that be from that extreme to that? But the evidence is clear on it. So not only will it reduce and help with women being safer, it actually like helps men to be healthier and happier. And takes the pressure off men. So that's what men can do, even if you aren't able to have those hard conversations and pull someone up. Just by role modelling that type of actions and behaviours is so powerful.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting conversation around masculinity at the moment, you know, and what being a strong man looks like. And I think, like, you know, you talked about like the holistic, you know, think about it holistically earlier when we were talking about this issue. And I think it's the same sort of thing when we think about masculinity too, right? Like, you're talking about a whole side of it that is like there's like a shadow over it, you know, whereas it's actually a critical part of what makes us whole. You know, and those other parts of us, like that, you know, tackle harder, be strong, you know, like there's elements of that are physically our essence of being like trying to be like represent our masculinity physically. And I feel like when there's no spaces for us as men to be able to express those parts of us, and there's no ability for us to connect in healthy ways to express that masculinity, then there's a real impact on how that can be manifested toxically when you have a real poor sense of self and trauma and identity and all this sort of stuff, and then it manifests in violence.
Yeah, and plays out in control because of fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all those things. And that, I say that never to excuse it. There is no excuse for violence against women, but that's a part that a man could play in terms of opening that, initiating those conversations, seeking out opportunities. So no longer can we accept that, I'm a good man, I respect my partner, and I'm a good father and I respect women. We need more than that. And we need you to show up for us when it counts. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
In my current role, we do talk about ways in terms of preventing violence before it starts, and those kind of masculinity things is some of the work that our watch does, and also just around shifting attitudes around men being more women not being equal to men, and just being respectful. And if you think about like leaders of the country, they're mostly middle class men,
white men,
very powerful men. So we kind of, if we want to be serious about this commitment, we need like those men to really like get on board and lead this. And I often think about COVID as a good example. Like we've got this attention at the moment, which is great and amazing, but due to horrific circumstances. But if I think about COVID, like despite what you think about anything to do with COVID outside of that, we saw a country from the top up pour every type of resource you could possibly imagine into something that they wanted everyone to know about, every hour of the day, everyone to learn about with a specific goal, an action that they wanted to happen.
Totally.
So we know that if this mattered enough and if women were important enough, we know that our country can make it a top priority.
Yeah.
We've seen it.
Absolutely.
So, but, from where us as individuals, there's always stuff that we can do, and it is everybody's business. And I think that's another really important thing we have to talk about. You talked about that, woman that was running and she got away. But there's a real difference between men's violence against women in a relationship and men's violence against women from a random bloke.
Yeah.
If I was to tell you now that I go home tonight and my husband, who I've told everyone what a top bloke he is, say we only met a year ago, and I've introduced him to people, I've told everyone, guess what I got for my birthday today? We just went away for the weekend. All those things. I've introduced him to people at my work, maybe colleagues. I've put him on social media. He's the one.
Yeah. Having
this, I'm madly in love, and then I go home tonight and he strangles me out of the blue. Am I going to get the same response as if I go home tonight and I go to Coles and I get groceries and I'm pushing my trolley to the car and put it in the boot of my car, and a random bloke comes up and strangles me? I'm going to have distress. I'm going to be traumatized, but I'm not going to be ashamed to tell anyone. I'm going to be ringing triple O as quick as my fingers will let me. Making a report, ringing my boss, I can't come to work, this is what's happened, telling my family and friends, oh my God, this is what happened to me, upset. But if it's our partners, we get shame about it.
Absolutely.
And somehow it's our fault. So that is a big issue, that even if we have all these resources that we need, all the frontline resources, all the crime prevention work, men's healing programs, victim survivor healing programs, police and child protection accountability, if we can't tell someone that's close to us, we're going to be like silenced, and we're not going to be able to speak up to, and then it gets to that severe end of the scale, which, the statistics for our women are 35 times more likely to be hospitalised.
Yeah, wow.
Now, isn't that insane even to say it?
It's crazy.
How are we not outraged?
Absolutely.
If we said double, that would be unacceptable. But we're saying 35 more times, because by the time you get needing to go to hospital, you're at the other end of it, because you can't tell anyone because you've been shamed to and you're not believed, or you could be misidentified as the perpetrator, or your children could be at risk of being removed, and 11 times more likely to be murdered. So until we have these conversations like we're having today, but every day, in every aspect of our life, and addressing, our attitudes around women and being respectful with women, where we work, where we play, where we learn, where we go to school, where we socialise, every aspect and pocket of our life, there's an opportunity to shift attitudes in society, but how we view women.
Yeah, absolutely. I was having this conversation with my daughter because we were talking about this sort of stuff, and like I remember studying legal studies in high school, and was looking at family law, and it was like the woman was the property of the man legally under law until like the 80s or the 90s. Like it was, within a generation, you know. And then you look at like where we are now as a society, and then I was yarning with someone else about this same sort of issue, and he was like, I feel like it's a combination of like the trauma and addiction coupled with the stuff around masculinity. But like it was talking about like the epidemic of like porn addiction in young men, gambling addiction, alcohol, drugs, mental health, whatever, compound that with other stuff as well, and then you layer the masculinity element on top of that in terms of men not understand, not having a strong sense of their self and how, who they are as a man, feeding into all that sort of stuff. And we just sort of think about like talking about how we design solutions to try and address this sort of stuff. I think one is like, how do we deal with this complexity around shame? Like, how do we navigate that? Like if you had a unlimited resources to try and drive a change in that sort of space, what would that look like? Would it be communications campaigns? Would it be like more information and education on the ground?
I think it needs all of it. So it needs from that prime prevention where we're talking about the attitudes and the entitlement that you just talked about, where men owning women and men viewing women as it's their right to control women. So those things which start from little, it starts from little boys, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It starts from preschool, it starts from in our homes. So all those conversations and all that education is absolutely critical component. So anything to do with disrespectful women and women not being equal is critical component, but it's one component. That can't stop women experiencing violence and abuse alone, but it's all of it. It's that early intervention. It's that really the frontline services, making sure that they never turn someone away, that they're fully funded, making sure that communities' solutions are community-led. I couldn't sit here even with the experience I've had to be able to possibly, and nor should I, tell you what should be rolled out in Alice Springs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a big problem.
Critical point.
Yeah, the policies and the funding and that's being based on a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yes.
So we've seen how that goes.
Totally.
It doesn't work. But not only does it not work, it's actually disrespectful to those people in those communities. What works in Redfern is not going to work in Darwin.
Totally.
What works in Canberra can't work in Brisbane. We don't, so having those each being, if we're really committed, if we're really serious, Aboriginal people have been talking about what needs to happen forever, but it hasn't been really cemented into policies where there's accountability. So we know, especially in this space and especially with our women, we know that we have the solutions of what to do, and we haven't up to date been listened to. Not really. So if we think about all the ends of the spectrum, the healing, the racism, addressing racism and discrimination and trauma, so having real funding and resources to be able to support men. Obviously then, the perpetrator accountability, because there are, in some cases, men who just are repeat offenders despite that support, and we can't leave women unsafe.
Totally.
So our laws and our legal system to be set up properly. It's just a whole spectrum. But for me, in where I'm working now, I can really, and from where I was working, I can see that nothing's going to change until we as a society are all talking about it. It becomes important to us. And on that as well, it's really important that we add sexual violence, because that's another level where women are ashamed to talk about. That's actually very connected to DV. They go together a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
And people don't know even what sexual violence is.
You talk about like the like again, like that holistic approach to how we try and tackle and address this sort of stuff. And now sitting in this, nationwide role that you're in terms of strategy, I guess one of the challenges that we see from a policy perspective is like, we know that makes sense, right, in our communities in terms of how we design solutions. But when we're working in government, often funding is tied to specific areas. So, I'm not sure where DV funding sits within the government space. I'm assuming it sits within, justice and communities and justice sort of space maybe. But you're talking about stuff around like healing and trauma, which, maybe sits within the health and wellbeing sort of funding sectors, and education and awareness when we're talking about young children and gender equality. And so there's all these different facets around what is impacting this as such a national crisis in terms of how we address this issue that is not going to be solved by just one department or one agency. This is a collective, holistic, whole of government, whole of nation response, really, coming back to what you said around how we mobilised for COVID and invested everything into breaking down the silos to get the messages across to solve, and get the outcomes we needed. It sounds like the similar sort of thinking is needed, to do this sort of stuff.
That's right, yeah. Like there are some organisations who have that holistic services available, but that's rare.
Yeah.
Usually it's just this DV space or a refuge or a men's program. With Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men, I have to always just think about culture and the power of culture, which I'm no expert on, but having, sons who have had their opportunity to be going out bush and seeing how they come back and the impact that makes on them, and connecting back to the power of connecting back to how our men loved our women and respected our women.
Absolutely.
And it's all there.
Absolutely.
And to have that opportunity to be able to access that again and have the resources and the ability to freely be able to access it again. But there's so many parts of it, but there actually is a lot of solutions. To me, it's a matter of whether the government are going to put their money where their mouth is and actually commit to what they're saying is their commitment, which is to end violence against women.
That's a good segue because the budget got released this week. Hey, and significant investment into this sort of space. Is that right?
Look, there's a lot of people considering where we're at, the conversation we're at, and the crisis level we're at. Mainstream Australia consider this as a crisis level now, but we've been in a crisis for a long time. So there's been an expectation for a budget that matches the crisis. And if you speak to a lot of people, I think they'll all agree that the budget that was released does not match the crisis. There was a bit of, good chunk of money to, I think it's called the Leaving Home Violence Program. But there's conditions on that we often don't maybe hear about. There's conditions on that you've had to have made a report. It's very admin heavy. Yeah. So the frontline workers who are already who under-resourced, who didn't get any,
and underpaid.
Yep, who didn't get any money, are then having to do all these forms, and a lot of those that payment gets rejected. So we don't hear about those kinds of things. There was some money into transitional accommodation, which we welcome. So important accommodation is a huge issue of why women can't leave. But I've worked with women to get them into transitional accommodation. It's short term and you're back in the same spot again. Yeah. So we need appropriate permanent housing. If you don't have a safe home, you can't recover. You can't break the cycle. You can't go on to leave a successful life and move forward and heal. Nobody could, because you've got to have that security in knowing where you're going to be living next week, next month.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's the same thing in, in the space that we worked in together, right? Like that housing stuff is a critical first point of call before you can even start to deal with, the trauma and the healing and everything else that goes with it, which is only compounded, right, given the housing crisis sort of stuff and accommodation stuff we're seeing as a country too. You talked about, I guess, what we can do around attitudes against women and discrimination. He gave that example of, that two guys running together and seeing another woman. Can you talk us through maybe a similar example with coercive control? Because it's one of those ones that it's a bit more, it's covert, right?
Yeah, I think
if someone picks up that they reckon their mate is doing stuff like that.
Yeah, just think about control. I think coercive control kind of makes us think, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
But coercive is, persuading someone to do something they're unwilling to do. So control exists in any form of violence and abuse in any context. But if I just think about, say you're with a mate at the pub, for example, and their partner's out, maybe at their work Christmas party or something, and and you've seen it before, but that they're texting, like bombarding their partner with hundreds of texts, and or they might even be expressing that it's like, you need to come home, and you might even hear conversations around, get home, and controlling who you speak to, where you spend your time, what you're wearing, what you're doing, what you're spending your money on. That's a really common thing that we actually, I have no doubt that we've seen before. So actually having a conversation, being brave and having a conversation about that with your mate, and sometimes that could be hard. It could be with someone that's a family member that you really respect. You could know about someone that you play footy with that does that, and they're a top bloke.
Yeah.
Often these blokes are top blokes.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're good men.
Absolutely.
And they're really popular men.
Yeah.
So having conversations about, like that control around like where your partner's going, who they spend their time with, what they're wearing is, that is disrespectful.
Yeah.
That is treating a woman that's less equal than you, that they can't have autonomy to make their own decisions what they do. And that breeds an environment where violence and abuse can occur.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like as someone sitting here who it just resonated when you talk about that, because I've been in a situation personally where I've had friends that have been in domestic violence situations, and they've come to me and they've said this is what happened, and to actually to think about how you navigate those conversations with someone is for anyone listening that has ever sat in that sort of situation, as someone who thinks they're a pretty solid fella, trying to have that conversation is probably one of the hardest conversations you ever have, because you're dealing with, one, I'm so glad that this person's been able to actually disclose that.
Yep.
And two, I've got a real opportunity here to not shame them, but reinforce the issue and how critical it is, that they seek help for what else might be going on, and that stuff can never happen again. And I remember that conversation as clear as day, and it wasn't a long conversation, it wasn't a lecture, but it was about holding space and acknowledging that and going, yeah, but Brad, that can't happen again, and that's happening because of A, B, and C, and if you aren't looking after A, B, and C and sorting that out, this is going to keep happening again, and she's a really good woman, and you're going to lose her, and she'll be gone, and honestly, some of the hardest conversations I've had in my life, but I remember it it was clear as day, and I'm sure I could have navigated that conversation better as well. I reflect back on it and I'm like, fuck, I should have said this, or maybe I should have been more assertive. But then I think about even the stuff we've been talking about today, what power, in the context of shame or all that sort of stuff, would it have had the same impact?
Yeah. Sounds like you did a really good job.
Tried to.
And the fact that he disclosed that to you does say that he obviously views you as a safe person.
Yeah.
But I think, opening that space where, because you're a person that communicates and vulnerable and has deep conversations, will allow that conversation to be able to come to you. And I think, it's good. You've talked about the A, B, and C that you think that might be his reasonings to why he's feeling this way, that he needs to behave in this way. But, I guess the next step is being a person that, following up with that bloke.
Yeah.
Following
yeah.
up and saying that, I'm here anytime you want to talk. Next time you're feeling those things, like what are the kind of feelings that you're getting before you lose it? What's coming in for you physically or what's going in your head?
Yeah.
Maybe like when that happens, give me a call.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to judge or tell you what to do, but let's talk it through.
Yeah.
Let's see what's rational and what's not. Let's talk it through. And then what you do is, I can't control that. Let's talk it through. And then maybe then also just trying to find some professional help or other support services where you can maybe like connect him up with and and just have that door open that, you want to talk to him again. Let's keep talking about this, and get him as much help as possible. But being that person that you're going to keep checking in and following through and seeing what's happening and without judgment and just saying, like you said, this can't happen.
Yeah.
There's no room for this. And also I think a really powerful way to connect with men who are fathers who are behaving in abusive ways is to talk about the impacts of kids. A lot of people think if the kid wasn't home or the kids weren't home and witnessed it, that they weren't impacted. But it absolutely does impact. If you love your kids, you're not going to be abusive to their mother because their mother will not be able to parent the same way she could if she wasn't living in with that.
Yeah, totally.
It's a different way you can parent if you're in a healthy relationship versus if you're in a toxic one.
Yeah.
And that stuff, I believe, resonates with men because we know there's lots of men who love their kids and they don't want to be like that. But just that connection and having those conversations and following through. But it sounds like you did a really good job.
Yeah, I think, look, the biggest thing in that situation was when I did check in with him and he did go and seek help and he went and he got I think he got a mental health care plan and he got referral to go seek support and stuff. But he couldn't find any counsellors or psychologists that were appropriate. Yeah. Like he went to one that was this big flash guy from a completely different world that tried to sell him his book. When he went to the thing, he just had some really gross experiences trying to find support. And he got it eventually. But when he was talking to me about it, I was just like, you can just imagine the amount of people that, they even go to make that first step, Aboriginal or not, and then the support that they reach out for is just, it's not appropriate.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that at all.
Yeah.
And as I think that goes back to saying around, you can't teach this from a textbook.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter how many
absolutely.
qualifications you've got. And, getting counsel, this is counselling if we were having a yarn now and you were talking to me about your behaviours or vice versa.
Yeah.
This is counselling. So having, those support opportunities where men just get to speak to each other. But imagine men always getting to have these yarns like you had and that was normal how we women do.
Yeah, totally.
Imagine that.
Totally.
Where before it got to that level, they're already telling you, this is how I'm feeling about this. I'm shame about it. This is how I'm feeling about this. And then they've got all these men that are able to talk that through.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's definitely missing. As a woman, I have experience in knowing how that is for men, but I hear about it a lot and I know it's true. But I have no doubt that we're lacking those resources for those opportunities for men who really want to acknowledge what they're doing is wrong. It's unacceptable for themselves. And want to seek help. I have no doubt that we are lacking those resources, and that's what I talked about in the holistic approach, which includes working with men. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's a if we want to end the crisis, right, we have to those resources have to be there, and we have to be able to, whilst it's about addressing really fucking violent and criminal behaviour, it's also about making sure that resources are there to be able to,
intercept.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. You touch on that story about children, and not, and trying to connect with people as well around. And I think I touched on, I wasn't going to talk about that personal experience with my friend, even though it's, de-identified and no one will be able to connect those dots. But I think it's really important for people listening, because I think if you're a follower that's listening to this and you might have stuff going on for whatever reason and that's manifesting in this sort of behaviour, I think, take a moment to understand and look for people around you where you can reach out and have those conversations. you know, and there is support, and we've talked about some of the challenges to that, but, you know, take those first steps and, you know, really look at how you can address and understand why that sort of stuff's happening and reduce the risk of that ever happening again.
Yeah, true. And also just like for anyone who would be listening to that advice is just to know that that is a very courageous thing to do, a very admirable thing to do, and that, you know, any woman, I believe, would be so, that's something that would earn respect, and something that you could be really proud to say that you did.
Absolutely. You talk about the connection around kids and families, you know, and like I'm a big fan of WAGEC because like my mum spent time in WAGEC, and it was crazy because I was living in a foster home that was on Victoria Street, and she got put in WAGEC and spent time there whilst I was in the foster home. So we sort of spent a bit of time together in different support accommodation services. So I've always got a really strong spot for the amazing work that they do. But, you know, I didn't grow up seeing a lot of domestic violence, but I'll tell you what, I remember every instance that, you know, I saw my mother with the, a black eye, or, you know, the story of her running into a door and all this sort of stuff. And even as a young kid, you know, we're very smart. Kids are very intelligent. We know what's happening in our worlds and environments. So even if you're thinking that, you know, the risk is minimized because the kids might not be in the room, they're very much still hurt, just like, you know, your partner as well. So
yeah, it's really important we don't forget about
kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Really reiterate that sort of stuff. I'm conscious of time, and I feel like, you know, this is something that is so important that we, you know, shouldn't be trying to rush out of. But I want to make sure that we touch on anything else that we probably haven't got to. You've talked about some of the priority issues right now. We've gone deep into trying to understand coercive control and provide some practical tools for people listening to identify and also respond to that sort of stuff. I guess, like, we've talked about the challenges, but what are some of the, I guess, have you seen some, despite the fact that we're in a crisis right now with what's going on, is there things that are working well? Because I find often we talk about the problem and the challenge with anything trying to find solutions, but often, like, there's also things that are working really well that we just need to keep reinvesting in. And is there things happening that you've seen in your role now or in your past where you're like, this is just like fucking best practice, and if we can just keep doing this sort of stuff, we'll keep getting good outcomes?
Yeah, I do. I'm just thinking straight away of since I've got this national kind of lens on now, that I've been able to hear a bit about Tangentyere Women's Council up in Alice Springs, who developed their own crime prevention campaign called Girls Can, Boys Can, and it's around the it's for small children, but it applies to anyone. Just like there's so many like little programs that to me, when I looked at this program, I was like, wow, why isn't this like why isn't this a household name? It's so good.
Yeah.
And just you mentioned WAGEC, when they're doing work now in the crime prevention space, which is excellent, going into childcare centres and training childcare workers. When we know that the evidence tells us that gender inequality is a key driver, you know, even like how we provide that childcare and that education in that small age around, we give women, little girls, the oven and the saucepans.
Yep, totally.
And we give the boys the cars.
Yep.
So all those things. So there's lots of good work happening. You can't see it so much, but I really can feel and see that we're talking about it more than we have before, not like before this crisis.
Yep.
I feel that that men are talking about it more. Even 10 years ago, if I went to a DV conference, lucky to see one or two men. Now you see more men.
Yeah, mad.
So I think that there is changes. It's slow. It's not quick enough, and we don't have time for slow.
Absolutely.
But I think that, there is lots of things happening. There's, gender equality training in universities and TAFes. There's, frontline services, places that are doing really good work. I know in my former role, I know that there was, really successful outcomes where people have gone on to like actually become advocates and work in this space and talk about their stuff and go on and, and have broken the cycle. I remember one of my clients just saying, I just can't believe how happy I am now and is in this healthy relationship. So there is really lots of good work going on. But to really, if we want to be serious about ending this violence, we need to like fund it and resource it and commit to it appropriately. And that's not happening right now.
Absolutely. I want to, I guess, bring this back as we come towards the end of what we're talking about today. The shirt you're wearing, any significance around why you picked that today? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
It's from IATSIS in Canberra. They made this shirt years ago, but for an International Women's Day event. But that lady there is my mum's sister, Auntie Jude Harris, and that's her daughter, Lena Harris, both women who I highly respect and admire, and strong cultural women. So, I felt like I wanted to wear this today specifically.
Got them there with you.
Bringing them with me. Auntie Jude's not here anymore, but she was a really strong woman and also really empathetic and kind woman that anyone could go to. So that I just felt like I wanted to wear the shirt today for that.
Yeah, well, the apple don't fall too far from the tree there, because I think their qualities manifest in you. It's pretty clear on and hear about this sort of stuff too. Any women that are listening right now, can I ask you to talk to them about any sort of thing that you want to get clear for them to take away?
Yeah, for any women or young girls that are in this position right now with violence and abuse, and I use the word abuse because it doesn't need to be physical. It doesn't. So violence or abuse, I would want them to know that we believe you. We believe you. There is support. What that support looks like for you might be different for someone else. And that's for you to know, because you're the expert of your situation. That you don't need to feel guilty if you've stayed in that for a bit longer, then you don't, feel proud of that and you feel like you haven't been able to leave. Don't feel guilty about that. That and you'll get there. But the biggest thing that I want to leave with anyone that's in that position is the shame doesn't belong with you. The shame does not belong with you.
Absolutely.
And tell someone. It may not mean that you're going to go to the police, but tell someone. It could mean if someone that's close to you that you trust. If you don't have someone that's close to you that you trust, go tell your doctor. But don't let silence shame you any longer, because you don't need to feel shame. It doesn't belong with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come sit here and yarn about this sort of stuff. I think, you're talking about, being worried about how you'd be able to sit down and talk about this sort of stuff. But I think once we got going, it was pretty clear how much experience and knowledge you have to share with the people that follow this sort of stuff. And, our audience is made up of people that are, working in the policy space and making decisions and informing practice, or they are professionals on the front line, or they are community members. So we have a really diverse audience that's specific to the issue. And we've talked about, I guess the whole nexus of this issue. And I feel like that there's so much value for anyone that's from either of those parts of this puzzle to be able to listen to you and be able to take something tangible away in terms of the situation right now and how we can try and progress forward. So I just want to thank you for all the work that you do, the years and the time and the energy that you've donated, to our people, to our women, to our families, the lives I'm sure you've probably saved as part of that journey, and, for the impact that you're now having at that national level in terms of trying to bring all that experience, to those spaces as well. And really, bringing those right principles in there around solutions being place-based and community-led, like you talked to as well. And so, thank you so much for coming in, and I really look forward to us getting to share some space again.
Thank you, Sam. And it's really important for me to acknowledge that there's been so many women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in particular, who have been leading this and been so strongly advocating for this and speaking for our voices long before my time.
100%.
And that is why we, have any voice now at all, is because of those women. So it's really important that I acknowledge that and thank those women. And thank you for this time today, especially as a man, because this is everybody's business. It's got to be everybody's business.
Absolutely.
Intimate partner relationship violence is everybody's business. It's got to stop. As a society, that we just can't accept this anymore. And it's time. It's way past time. And these conversations are part of that solution.
Absolutely.
So thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you, sis.